Stan Laurel had a unique gift for making people laugh, and his charm as part of the iconic comedy duo Laurel and Hardy still resonates today. But did you know that the laughter Stan created hid a life filled with personal tragedy and hardship? Behind those laughs, his life was full of hardships that went far beyond what most fans knew. Heartbreaking personal losses to battles on the professional front, Stan's life was far from easy. His story isn't just about comedy, it's about resilience, heartbreak, and an unbreakable spirit. One of the most devastating blows he faced was losing his son to the tragic grip of death. But before we dive into the pain and loss, let's take a moment to remember the great moments of Stan Laurel's life, the laughter he brought to millions, and the full picture of the man behind the comedy. Arthur Stanley Jefferson, or as the world would later know him, Stan Laurel, was born on June 16, 1890, in his grandparents' house in Ulverston, Lancashire. From the very start, Stan's life was anything but ordinary. His parents, Arthur J. Jefferson, a traveling actor and theatre manager, and Margaret, an actress, were too busy performing to raise a baby on the go. So Stan spent his early years living with his grandparents, George and Sarah Metcalf, and getting pretty cozy with the town of Ulverston. Stan wasn't just hanging out playing with toys, he was absorbing the sights and sounds of Ulverston, attending church with his grandparents at Holy Trinity, and apparently developing a serious sweet tooth for Beer's treacle toffee from Gillam's General Store. Might think the stage was always calling him, but Stan's first steps toward comedy were far more humble. Stan's love for the stage kicked off just across the street from his grandparents' place, at the Hippodrome Theatre. It was a wooden, canvas-roofed theatre where his parents performed. Dad would develop some of the plays he'd become famous for right there. So while Stan was growing up, he wasn't just playing in the streets, he was watching performances and getting acquainted with the magic of the theatre. Sadly, in 1910, the Hippodrome burnt down, but that same year Stan set sail for America, but we'll get to that in a movie. Stan spent some time living with his grandma, Sarah Metcalf, in North Shields, before attending schools like King James I Grammar School and the King's School. Little did Stan know, this early exposure to the stage was shaping him for greatness. Eventually, his family packed up and moved to Glasgow, where Stan's dad managed the Metropole Theatre. It was here that Stan really caught the bug for performing. At 16, he jumped into the world of theatre, performing his first professional gig at the Panopticon in Glasgow. This was also the moment when he probably realized that getting paid to make people laugh was a pretty sweet deal. In 1910, at the age of 20, Stan joined Fred Karnit's troupe, adopting the stage name Stan Jefferson. But the story takes a fascinating turn here, because this is when he crossed paths with a certain legend. This is where things really started to get interesting, because his fellow troupe member wasn't just anyone, it was Charlie Chaplin. Yep, the two future legends were traveling around, performing slapstick comedy and likely trying to out-silly each other. Stan even got a chance to be Chaplin's understudy. They both hopped on the same ship to the US, and well, the rest is comedy history. While the world was at war, Stan registered for military service, but thanks to his deafness and his status as a resident alien, he got a free pass. Still, he wasn't going to let anything stop his journey toward comedy greatness. After the Karnit troupe disbanded in the spring of 1914, Stan didn't just sit around waiting for the next big thing. He teamed up with a couple of fellow former Karnit performers, Edgar Hurley and his wife Ethel, and together they formed the Three Comics. But this was just the beginning of a series of partnerships that would shape Stan's future, and one of them would change comedy history forever. On the advice of their booking agent, they decided to rename themselves the Keystone Trio, a nod to the famous Keystone Cops that were all the rage in comedy at the time. During this phase, Stan started experimenting with his character, doing an imitation of his old pal Charlie Chaplin. Meanwhile, the Hurleys began playing the parts of silent film stars Chester Conklin and Mabel Normand. Though the trio enjoyed some success, there was a sense that something bigger was on the horizon. They toured successfully from February to October 1915, but eventually the trio broke up and Stan went off to new adventures. From 1916 to 1918, Stan teamed up with Alice Cook and Baldwin Cook to form the Stan Jefferson Trio. This period marked the beginning of lifelong friendships and crucial professional steps for Stan. This partnership was more than just for the stage. Alice and Baldwin would become lifelong friends, but in 1921, Stan's path crossed with another important figure, Oliver Hardy. They briefly worked together on the silent short The Lucky Dog, but it wasn't yet the legendary partnership we all know and love. Around this time, Stan also met actress May Dahlberg, who suggested that his stage name, Stan Jefferson, was unlucky due to it having 13 letters. Talk about superstition influencing a career. So, like any good superstitious performer, Stan changed his stage name to Laurel and started fresh. It wasn't long before Laurel was offered $75 a week to star in 2 real comedies, and he jumped at the opportunity. After making his first film Nuts in May, Universal offered him a contract, but as it often goes in Hollywood, that contract didn't last long. Hollywood had its way of testing talent, but Stan wasn't one to back down. A studio reorganization led to it being cancelled, but that didn't stop Stan. He and May appeared together in several films, including the 1922 parody Mud and Sand, a film that had its own brand of ridiculousness. By 1924, Stan had fully committed to the world of film, signing a contract with Joe Rock to star in 12 two-reel comedies. At this point, Stan was making moves that would eventually lead him to comedy greatness, but he still had some hurdles to overcome. There was a quirky stipulation attached to this contract. May Dahlberg was not allowed to appear in any of these films. Joe Rock believed that her temperament was holding Stan back, so in 1925, when May started interfering with Stan's work, Rock offered her a cash settlement and a one-way ticket back to her native Australia. Sometimes, even love has to take a backseat to a budding career. May accepted, and that was the end of their partnership, but Stan's career was just getting started. 1924 to 1925, Stan filmed a series of comedies, including Mandarin Mix-Up and Detained, and by 1925, he had directed or co-directed 10 silent shorts, though he didn't appear in them himself. However, his future comedy partner Hardy did make appearances in 3 of these films: Yes, Yes, Nanette, Wandering Puppers, and Madam Mystery. Though the iconic duo hadn't yet formed, the pieces were already in place. Laurel's career was steadily moving forward, and though it wasn't quite the powerhouse duo yet, the wheels were in motion for him and Hardy to become one of the greatest comedy teams of all time. Stan Laurel's next big step in his career came when he signed with Hal Roach Studios. First, he had grand plans to focus on writing and directing, and he even directed a film in 1925 called Yes, Yes, Nanette. But destiny had something even bigger in store for Stan. In that film, his future comedy partner Oliver Hardy had a role under the stage name Babe Hardy, but life had other plans. That same year, Hardy, who was part of the Hal Roach Studios Comedy All-Stars, got into a kitchen mishap and ended up in the hospital. With Hardy out of commission, Stan was asked to step in and act in the film Get Him Young. Little did they know, this would be the moment that launched one of the greatest comedy duos in history. This is where things took a turn. Stan and Oliver began sharing the screen together, and the magic started to happen. By early 1927, Laurel and Hardy were a staple on-screen duo. It was undeniable. Something about their chemistry made them unstoppable. They starred in several short films including Duck Soup, Slipping Wives, and With Love and Hisses. The duo's chemistry was undeniable, and it didn't take long for the folks at Roach Studios to notice how the audience responded to their antics. Director Leo McCarey, seeing the potential, began pairing them up more frequently, ultimately giving birth to the iconic Laurel and Hardy series later that year. What began as a simple pairing quickly became one of the most successful and beloved teams in comedy history. The team quickly became one of the most successful comedy acts of the silent film era, cranking out a solid collection of shorts like The Battle of the Century, Should Married Men Go Home, Two Tars, Be Big, and Big Business. Had such a natural rhythm that even the transition to talkies in 1929 didn't slow them down. Their first sound film, Unaccustomed as We Are, was a hit, and they made their first appearance in a feature film later that year as part of the review sequence in Hollywood Review of 1929. And they didn't stop there. The following year, they showed up in the all-color Technicolor musical The Rogue Song. In 1931, Laurel and Hardy reached another milestone with their first full-length starring feature, Pardon Us, and they kept the momentum going, making both features and shorts up until 1935. Their 1932 short The Music Box even earned them an Academy Award for Best Short Subject. It was a golden age for the duo, one that would cement their place in entertainment history. They were on top of the world. Comedy gold. But as anyone who's ever hit a high note knows, things can't stay perfect forever. The 1930s proved that even comedy legends aren't immune to conflict. In the 1930s, things got a little rocky for Stan Laurel and Hal Roach. The two had a falling out over contract issues, and that led to a major dispute. Roach had separate contracts for Laurel and Hardy with different expiration dates. This contract drama would put their partnership to the test. This meant that while Laurel's contract was up, Hardy's wasn't, so Roach kept Hardy at the studio and paired him up with other comedians, like Harry Langdon for the 1939 film Zenobia. There was even talk of creating a new series featuring Hardy and Patsy Kelly called The Hardy Family. Laurel wasn't having any of this, so he sued Roach over the contract situation. What started as a dispute over paperwork would turn into a battle for creative control. The legal battle eventually fizzled out, and Laurel returned to Roach Studios, but the relationship was never quite the same. It wouldn't be long before both Laurel and Hardy decided it was time to walk away from Roach for good. 1941, Laurel and Hardy signed a contract with 20th Century Fox, agreeing to make 10 films over 5 years. This new deal came with a catch that would leave a sour taste in Laurel's mouth. Much to Laurel's surprise, the pair was hired strictly as actors. No creative control over the writing, staging, or editing of the films. It was a far cry from the creative freedom they were used to at Roach. Still, their undeniable charm and chemistry carried him through, and their films continued to thrive. The films were a hit, and as their success grew, Laurel and Hardy gained more freedom. They slowly began adding their own material and making these films more personal. They would go on to become one of the most iconic duos in entertainment history. But just as their star was shining brighter than ever, tragedy struck in 1957. On August 7, 1957, Oliver Hardy died, and with him went half of one of the most beloved comedy duos in history. Loss hit Stan hard, but the true depth of their bond was revealed in the quiet moments that followed. News hit Stan Laurel like a punch to the gut. Laurel had lost his best friend, his creative partner, and really the only person who truly understood the strange, brilliant rhythm they shared. He was too ill to attend the funeral, but in a quiet, heartbreaking moment, he said, "Babe would understand." And if you knew anything about their bond, you'd know that was probably true. But Hardy's death wasn't just the end of a partnership, it marked the end of Stan's performing life. Hardy's death wasn't just the end of a professional partnership. It marked the end of Laurel's performing life. Despite receiving offers to return to stage and screen, he turned every single one down, not out of pride or stubbornness, but because he simply had no interest in working without Hardy. Stan, the act just wasn't the same without Babe. After all, their magic was built on an unbreakable partnership, and truthfully, nothing ever really was again. As painful as that loss was, it was far from the only tragedy Laurel had to carry. Behind the laughter and applause was a man who faced more than his fair share of personal heartache. His private life was filled with heartbreak, drama, and enough chaos. What the world saw was a man who made them laugh. What they didn't see was how much he endured once the spotlight dimmed. Behind Stan Laurel's slapstick brilliance and iconic bowler hat was a man whose personal life often felt more like a tragic melodrama than a comedy. While audiences laughed at his on-screen antics, Laurel was quietly carrying the weight of heartbreak, scandal, and deep personal sorrow, none greater than the devastating loss of his infant son. Laurel's relationship history alone reads like something out of a soap opera. He never officially married his early partner, May Dahlberg, but they lived together as common-law spouses from 1919 to 1925. Their relationship wasn't just personal, it shaped Stan's early career, and even his stage name. Dahlberg played a key role in his early career. She even helped invent the stage name, Stan Laurel. But when producer Joe Rock decided that Dahlberg was holding Laurel back professionally, he bought her a one-way ticket back to Australia. The split wasn't clean, and the drama didn't end there. She left, but the drama didn't end there. Over a decade later, in 1937, Dahlberg returned to the US and sued Laurel for financial support, just as he was going through a difficult divorce with his second wife. The lawsuit added insult to injury, and though the case was settled out of court, the public spectacle was one more bitter note in an already messy personal symphony. But no heartache compared to the tragedy that struck in May 1930. Nothing compared to what happened in May 1930. Laurel's first wife, Lois Nielsen, had given birth to their second child, a boy named Stanley Robert Laurel. He arrived 2 months premature. The couple clung to hope, but tragically, baby Stanley died just 9 days after his birth. For a man who spent his career making people laugh, this loss was a heartbreaking irony. For a man whose entire career was about bringing joy and laughter to others, this loss was a private and crushing sorrow. One Laurel never spoke much about publicly, but which undoubtedly left a deep scar. No amount of slapstick could heal that wound. No amount of slapstick or applause could dull that pain. Laurel's marital life continued to spiral into a complicated series of marriages and remarriages. After divorcing Lois in 1934, he married Virginia Ruth Rogers in 1935. But as many who've gone through tumultuous relationships know, the path to happiness isn't always smooth. That fell apart quickly. He admitted he still had feelings for Lois, but she wasn't interested in rekindling things. Then came Ilyana Shuvalova, a stormy union that ended with allegations as wild as Laurel trying to bury her alive in the backyard. Yes, you read that right, life with Stan Laurel wasn't always funny off-screen. That marriage crashed and burned in 1940. And then, perhaps out of habit, Laurel remarried Virginia Ruth Rogers again, only to divorce her a second time in 1946. That same year, he married Ida Katayeva Raphael, who would remain by his side until the end of his life. Through all the chaos, one constant remained: his resilience. Through all the public mishaps, private griefs, and headline-making divorces, Stan Laurel kept showing up on screen with a smile. But behind that smile was a man who had endured more than his fair share of pain, losing a child, losing love repeatedly, and eventually losing his closest creative partner. It was a tragic life painted in black and white, just like the films that made him a star. But even as the curtains closed on his performing days, his legacy continued to shine. After the curtains closed on the legendary Laurel and Hardy partnership, Stan Laurel quietly stepped away from the spotlight, but not from the hearts of his fans or the respect of his peers. While his days of performing were behind him, his legacy continued to grow, even as he lived in modest circumstances. In 1961, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences recognized Laurel's monumental contribution to comedy with an honorary Oscar for his creative pioneering in the field of cinema comedy. Though his body was frail, the recognition proved that his influence was far from fading. Though too frail to attend the ceremony himself, Laurel's influence was undeniable. Bob Hope introduced the award, and Danny Kaye accepted it on his behalf, a touching gesture that spoke volumes about how deeply loved and respected Laurel remained in the entertainment world. Despite having appeared in nearly 190 films, Stan Laurel's final years were a far cry from the glamorous Hollywood lifestyle many would expect. Laurel lived out his final years not in a Hollywood mansion, but in a small, unpretentious flat in the Oceana Apartments in Santa Monica. Fame hadn't spoiled him. In fact, Laurel kept his phone number listed in the public directory and frequently answered fan calls himself. He took pride in replying to fan mail and never lost the humility that had endeared him to millions. Imagine calling a legend and having them pick up the phone to chat like an old friend. If you were lucky enough to call him, he might just pick up and chat like an old friend. Comedians who followed in his footsteps often sought him out as a mentor. Jerry Lewis not only visited him but also incorporated Laurel's influence into The Bellboy, naming the main character Stanley and including a character modeled after Laurel, played by Bill Richmond. Jerry Lewis wasn't the only one who saw Laurel as a comedic icon. Dick Van did too. Dick Van had a similar experience. As a young performer, Van found Laurel's number, called him up, and was invited over for a visit. Later, Van paid tribute by portraying him in an episode of The Dick Van Show. This wasn't just admiration, it was an acknowledgement of Laurel's eternal impact on comedy. These weren't just acts of admiration. They were acknowledgements that Laurel's comedic DNA lived on in their work. When director Stanley Kramer offered Laurel a cameo in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, alongside other comedy greats like Buster Keaton and the Three Stooges, Laurel turned it down. Stan Laurel's loyalty to Oliver Hardy remained his guiding principle. He was adamant about not appearing on screen without Hardy, and he reportedly didn't want to be seen in old age. His loyalty to his late partner was unwavering. Still, a subtle nod was planned. A background shot featuring a double dressed in Laurel's signature bowler hat seated in an old convertible. But in the end, even this tribute couldn't quite capture the essence of Laurel. But even that brief tribute was ultimately reworked, with the cameo going to Jack Benny, who wore Laurel's hat in the final cut. In the end, Stan Laurel may have stepped away from the camera, but he never truly left the stage. His legacy wasn't just in the films, it lived on in the people he mentored and the fans he touched. Through the comics he mentored, the fans he delighted, and the timeless films he left behind, Laurel remained an eternal figure in the world of laughter, quiet, gracious, and still chasing the perfect joke until the very end. And speaking about the very end, Stan Laurel spent his final years quietly, far from the spotlight that had once followed him everywhere. By the mid-1960s, his health was starting to fade. Even the brightest stars must eventually dim, but Stan's final days were as humble as his character. In January 1965, doctors found an infection on the roof of his mouth and ran a series of tests. Then in February, he suffered a heart attack. Just a few days later, on the 23rd, he passed away peacefully in his armchair at the age of 74. Stan's passing wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet farewell from a man who had once made the world laugh without saying a single word. No big fanfare, no dramatic ending, just a quiet goodbye from a man who had once made the world laugh without saying a single word. His funeral was held at Church of the Hills in Los Angeles. It wasn't a massive Hollywood spectacle, but it was filled with the kind of people who genuinely admired him. Who truly knew Laurel understood that he was more than a comedian. He was a friend, a mentor, and a legend. Dick Van, who had grown close to Laurel in his later years, gave the eulogy. Van always saw him as more than just a comedic hero. He saw him as a friend and mentor. Buster Keaton was there too, paying tribute to someone he believed was in a league of his own. Stan Laurel wasn't just a comedic icon, he was a man whose influence transcended generations. Stan was buried at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills Cemetery. And while he might have been gone, his influence was everywhere. His legacy was more than the films he made, it was the timeless laughter he gave the world. It wasn't just the 190 films or the fame, it was the legacy he left behind with Hardy, the laughter they sparked together, and the blueprint they created for every comedy duo that came after.